Welcome, and thank you for joining today's teleconference, Western EIM Governance Review Committee meeting. Before we begin, please ensure you have opened the chat panel by using the associated icon at the bottom of your screen. If you require technical assistance, please send a chat to the event producer who is labeled as host. All audio lines have been muted until the Q&A portions of the call. I will give you instructions on how to ask a question at that time. With that, I'll turn the call over to Bert Gross, Deputy General Counsel. Bert, please go ahead.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining this meeting. As mentioned, I'm Bert Gross, Deputy General Counsel here at the CAISO. I'm just going to cover two housekeeping matters, which is to take the attendance for the GRC and then go over their approval for the last public minutes, and then we'll turn to the substance, and I'll turn it over to Chair Hampton at that point. So first, with regard to attendance, GRC members, please be sure you have your phones off of mute, and I'll go in order here. Tony Braun.
Here.
Andrew Campbell.
Here.
Suzanne Cooper.
Here.
Eric Eisenman.
Here.
Valerie Fong.
Here.
Angelina Galitova.
Here.
Jennifer Gardner.
Here.
Therese Hampton.
Here.
Doug Howe.
Here.
Chris Raper.
Here.
I'll check with, is Rob Taylor here yet? I think he might be joining a little later, but if you're in, please let us know. Okay, well, then moving along, Rebecca Wagner.
Here.
I believe Mary Winke is not going to be on today, so I'll move on to the last but not least, Cameron Yurkowski.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, great. So we have a quorum to proceed. The next item would be to approve the April 26th, 2021 general session minutes of the GRC. To do that, I need a motion from one of the voting members of the GRC followed by a second. So if somebody could please move on the minutes, that would be great.
This is Tony. I'll move.
Okay. Is there a second?
This is Therese. I second.
Okay, Therese, thank you. And then we'll just go down the list again. This time only the voting members, of course. Tony Braun.
Aye.
Andrew Campbell.
Aye.
Suzanne Cooper.
Aye.
Eric Eisenman.
Aye.
Jennifer Garner.
Aye.
Therese Hampton.
Aye.
Doug Howe.
Aye.
Chris Raper.
Aye.
Rebecca Wagner.
Aye.
And Cameron Yurkowski.
Aye.
Okay, so the minutes have been unanimously approved by all voting members present. With that, I think I can turn it over to Therese to get to the substance of the meeting. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Bert. Appreciate it. And can we go to the next slide that includes the agenda? So thank you for joining us this afternoon. I know it is a later afternoon meeting, especially for those in Mountain Time. We appreciate you being here. We have two primary goals today. We want to share with you the concepts in the straw proposal and answer any questions you have about it. And then we want to hear from stakeholders about how this proposal aligns with your interests. We have a panel that has agreed to share, and we're really interested in their thoughts and then any thoughts that any of you on the line might have as well. We have asked the panelists two questions. They're on slide 10 of the PowerPoint. I'm going to read them to you now just so that if you're listening and you want to think about these. We want to talk about how does these proposals meet your interests related to delegation of authority for EIM, and what other interests do you want the GRC to consider related to delegation of authority for EIM. So the goal here is we've put out a straw proposal. We really want to get additional information so that we can make decisions going forward. So if we can go back to the agenda, I'll kind of talk a little bit about what we're going to do today on slide 2. We'll give an update on part 1 of the draft final proposal, what we've just recently completed, and then we'll really move in. The bulk of the meeting today is about part 2, the straw proposal, and Jennifer Gardner and Tony Braun will help explain what the substance of the proposal is, and then we'll have the panel discussion and open it up for comment and questions from all of you. So if we can go to the next slide. We've kind of continually been starting these meetings with a reminder of what our charter is, and the charter does ask that we have an iterative public process to look at revisions to the EIM governance structure. The second bullet there says that we may consider potential governance enhancements for a day-ahead market in the event that is added. We've heard in stakeholder comments, both written and verbally, that they really want to see a more robust EDAM proposal before we consider any governance. So what we're talking about here today is EIM governance. We're focused on governance enhancements for the energy imbalance market and not to be necessarily confused or construed with what may be considered in the future for an EDAM. And we do work to develop a consensus proposal with all the members on the GRC. And we'll present to the EIM and the Board of Governors a proposal for their review and consideration. So we go to the next slide. We have just finished that process for part 1, the draft final proposal in April. The GRC at our last meeting approved the part 1 draft final proposal. In early May, there was a joint meeting of the board and the EIM governing body, and they unanimously approved that part 1 proposal. If we go to the next slide, here are the next steps. So what happens now that they've approved that proposal? One key step is that there are revisions being made to a couple of important or related governance documents, the Charter for EIM Governance and the EIM Governing Body Selection Policy. Modifications will be made to those to reflect the proposal that was approved. And there's advisory review by the EIM Governing Body on those changes, and the board has approval authority for those governance documents. In addition, there were some recommendations in the governance document for liaisons to be, non-voting liaisons to be part of the body of state regulators, and they have modified their charter to reflect the addition of those liaisons. And the Regional Issues Forum had some recommendations as well, and they are beginning the dialogue about how to change their operating guidelines to reflect those recommendations. So those are the follow-on actions related to the approval of our Part 1. So we go to the next slide. So Part 2 is all about topics of delegation of authority, and we've noted the 4 major parts of delegation authority here. Today we're going to talk just about scope of joint authority and the process for resolving potential deadlocks. We recognize there's more in the scope of joint authority, but these 2 issues that we've identified are the ones where we've received the most comment and actually really want to have more dialogue because we have this new proposal to have conversation about. So we go to the next slide. So I'm just going to give a really high-level overview, and then I'm going to turn it to Tony and Jennifer to do kind of the more detailed discussion of each of these elements. But if you look at it in its entirety, if this straw proposal is adopted, it would increase the current scope of issues over which the board and the EIM governing body would hold shared approval authority. And Tony will talk a little bit more about that, but it would expand those things where they have shared approval authority. The way it is structured, though, it's designed for both bodies to resolve any differences of opinion before anything is filed with FERC. But it does have recognition that you do need to have a dispute resolution mechanism in the event that there is an impasse between the 2 bodies or there are exigent circumstances and a FERC filing really needs to be made. In that instance, the board is provided the opportunity or can make the FERC filing. The EIM governing body is provided the opportunity to make a statement or an opinion, and it is included in the FERC filing with the help of outside counsel for the EIM governing body. And Jennifer is going to talk in more detail about that. So if we move to the next slide, we're going to turn it to Tony to talk about this new rule for the scope of joint authority.
Thank you, Therese. Thank you to everyone that joined us today. And multiple time zones, including the East Coast, if I recognize some names. So I really appreciate everyone taking the time to do this this afternoon and this evening. So the scope, the delegation and scope of joint authority is obviously a central matter of critical importance to the market participants. It's something that we struggled with internally, as you could recognize in other drafts, and we decided to take this extra time beyond the phase one, as Therese had outlined in our process here. So the current straw proposal that we put out uses a concept of tariff rule applicability, so that if there are proposals to change or establish a tariff rule that is applicable to the EIM entity balancing authority areas or their market participants within them in their capacity as participants in EIM, then that would be subject to joint authority. It excludes from joint authority proposals to change or establish new market rules that are applicable only to the CAISO BAA or to the CAISO controlled grid. So this is what we think is an expansion of the role of the governing body over likely a greater number of tariff provisions. We also would note that it is an expansion of the role of the Board of Governors over a host of market provisions as well, because today, when there is a matter that's subject to the primary authority of the EIM governing body, the matter solely appears on the consent agenda, and so that is, has been to date at least a fairly minimal role in the review of those matters. So we know that this is a highly important issue, and we are greatly encouraging robust comments on these. We also know we can't avoid some of the obvious questions that are going to arise and are arising in everyone's minds about the applicability of this test to both recent tariff changes and hot button issues that are before us today. So we thought we might share some of our initial thinking on this. These are just internal dialogue among GRC members. And again, we really encourage robust input on these matters, and I'm sure we're going to tee them up for the panelists today. So examples, we think, of recent issues that are advisory under the current structure that would be joint authority going forward if this proposal is adopted, would be the hydro DEBs under the local market power mitigation. Similarly, the storage default energy bids, as well as the Order 831 bid cap proposal, because those market rules apply to EIM entity BAs, EIM entities, or other market participants in their capacity as participants in the energy imbalance market. How would these rules apply to issues that are currently subject to controversy? We thought we would be really upfront and share some of our initial thinking on these things, because we know that's the lens through which a lot of these issues are going to be viewed. And we come to a conclusion, I think, that it depends. I think sometimes we get locked into some of the past proposals or the current proposals. And a good example, I think, of this is system market power mitigation. So a prior CAISO initiative proposed to apply system market power mitigation rules to sellers within the CAISO BAA. And if that were the initiative that would move forward, then we believe that would be under the exclusive authority of the board and not be, more precisely, under joint authority. However, if the CAISO were to undertake system market power mitigation initiative, and with it, scarcity pricing initiatives, and they were a comprehensive assessment, and they applied to entities, EIM entities, or the market participants in their capacity as participants in EIM, then they would be under joint authority as we interpret the proposal that we've developed and is out there today. So that's an example, I think, of the flexibility of this rule. It really depends on what the initiative covers. I think that if you look at things through the lens solely of what the ISO has put on paper in the past with respect to this, you come up with a different answer than if you look and examined whether any future initiative in this area would be broader. Export and load priority issues, obviously a hot topic right now. I think we've come to the internal conclusion in our deliberations that these would not be matters that would be subject to joint authority. And that's because the rules, by and large, are not applicable to EIM entity BAs in their capacity as participants in EIM. However, if the rules were broadened and changed to apply to EIM transfers, then I think we'd have to reconsider that internal, soft conclusion that I think we've reached to date. So that's our initial thoughts on how some of these high-profile issues might fall out under a joint authority model. But again, that represents our internal thought process to date and something in which we would really encourage robust conversation. We've also included a table of contents with illustrative examples of the tariff and how we think the joint applicable to test would apply to the relative provisions. We have had commenters that have provided a great deal of specificity, and we thought it was appropriate to respond with some specificity, and we urge everyone to take a look at that in careful detail and assess that and give us your views. So that is a not-so-quick overview, I think, of the scope test that we're proposing and that we're seeking comments on, and we hope to tee up for panelists after we get through our TRC presentation. Therese, what have I missed?
Nothing. I think that's great. Nice overview. Thank you. And so we'll go to the next slide, and we'll have Jennifer talk about dispute resolution, and then we will open it up. We'll open up the phone lines to see if people have questions of clarification of anything that Tony or Jennifer just covered.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Therese, and thanks, Tony, for that overview. So with regard to dispute resolution, I think that I should start off by saying that we heard pretty loud and clear from stakeholders that there was general discomfort with the previous framework that we had laid out in our prior straw proposal. And of course, that was the concept of dual or jump ball filings at FERC where the two bodies under joint authority were unable to come to agreement. You know, the concerns came from a lot of different angles, but I think it's safe to say that the common theme here was that there was just too much uncertainty created in allowing FERC to really make that final decision on market design issues. And of course, FERC is going to be the final arbiter in most of these cases on these 205 filings, unless an appeal is made. But in this case, there seems to be concern that we're really punting critical market design decisions to FERC. And I think that seems to be one of the core concerns that we were hearing from stakeholders throughout this process. So we wanted to come up with a dispute resolution process that was not a dual filing approach, but yet offered plenty of opportunity for collaboration between the two bodies before any type of filing was made at FERC. So the process is, of course, summarized here on the slide, but I'm going to provide just a little bit more detail similar to what Tony did so that folks have a better understanding of how this might work in practice. So so assuming that the two bodies are unable to reach agreement on a proposed tariff change that falls under joint authority, this is the iterative process that would then be kicked off as a result of that deadlock. So the matter would be remanded to CAISO staff to initiate another round of the stakeholder process. This is similar to the proposal in our prior straw proposal, so this part is not different. As a result of that stakeholder process, we would end up with a revised proposal that would then go to both bodies for their approval yet again. In that revised proposal, CAISO staff would be taking into account concerns from not only stakeholders who have been involved in that process, but also the bodies themselves. So if there have been concerns expressed by either body, those would also be taken into account. So following that second round of the stakeholder process and the revised proposal, if the two bodies are still unable to agree, they are given a certain degree of flexibility in terms of how best to proceed. So they could, for example, jointly decide to just abandon the proposal. Perhaps they decide that this matter is not timely, it's not an urgent matter that needs to be decided now, and we need to go back to the drawing board and reevaluate. So they could abandon it. They could also jointly agree with input from CAISO management on another way to resolve the matter. An example of this would be that they decide to commence another round of the stakeholder process. So that would be a total of 3 rounds. Now, I think a lot of folks realize, especially in light of summer readiness and the sort of the quick pace that we've all been engaged in to get those issues resolved, that a lot of times, or perhaps many times, we will not have time to go through this many rounds of the stakeholder process. And perhaps there are going to be unique circumstances that we would qualify as exigent circumstances where more immediate action needs to be taken. So we want to provide a pathway forward to make a FERC filing where both bodies remain deadlocked, but we find ourselves in exigent circumstances. So in those situations, we have to have certain criteria that are met before the Board of Governors can proceed with a 205 filing. So first, the board, by unanimous vote, has to make the following findings. The two bodies are at an intractable impasse, so they have remained deadlocked, they've tried alternatives, and they've been unable to reach agreement, and exigent circumstances exist such that a revision to the tariff is critical to preserve grid reliability or to protect market integrity. So probably the most obvious example of this type of exigent circumstance would be where we've seen evidence of market manipulation. There are obviously other examples that we could point to, but that to me seems to be the most obvious one. So in these circumstances, the CAISO would be required to include in its filing whatever written opinion the EIM governing body may decide to offer regarding the proposal. So keep in mind, we're in a situation here where exigent circumstances exist. The two bodies are deadlocked, that CAISO needs to move forward on a 205 filing because of those exigent circumstances. And so we are in a situation where the Board of Governors is moving forward under joint authority without the sort of explicit agreement of the governing body. And so in that situation, we still want to provide the governing body with the opportunity to essentially voice their concerns or their dissent with the proposed tariff change. And so another issue that we have, or another consideration that we've included in this proposal, is that we want to give the governing body the opportunity to retain outside counsel in preparing that statement, because that statement will be included in the 205 filing that FERC then has to decide on. And so we like the idea of allowing the governing body to retain outside counsel, because we heard from some stakeholders that they were concerned that if CAISO Legal was representing both bodies in a 205 filing, and this was under the dual filing approach that, of course, stakeholders were concerned with. But if CAISO Legal had to represent both bodies in such a scenario, that CAISO Legal could be conflicted from doing that. And so we appreciated those concerns. And so in this situation, even though it's not a dual filing, we want to make sure that the governing body does have the ability to retain outside counsel should they feel the need to do so when preparing that statement. So another issue that I think is worth highlighting here is that obviously the retention of outside counsel will bring up the question of who pays for this. And I will say that in our straw proposal, which is a very high-level proposal, and we're simply putting it out there to see how stakeholders feel about it, we have not gone into that level of detail. But I will say that in our recent proposal that was just approved by the governing body and the Board of Governors, we did provide for the governing body to hire an outside market expert. One way that we could pay for outside counsel would be similar to how we would be paying for this outside market expert. And of course, those costs would be recovered from all market participants, including those in the EIM balancing authority areas. And keep in mind that the argument for allocating those costs to all market participants is that the role and the mission of the governing body is not just to protect the interests of EIM entities, but really all market participants, particularly those in the real-time market, which would include other market participants besides just EIM entities. And so that was an argument that we made to support this method of payment for the outside market expert, so that similar reasoning could be used to pay for outside counsel in this case. Again, we haven't gone into that level of detail in our proposal. It's simply an option that we could consider, and we're certainly open to stakeholder feedback on that. So with that, I will stop, and Therese, let me just do a check to make sure I haven't missed anything.
Oh, it's all good. So at this point, before we transition to the panel, operator, if you can give instructions for how people we're looking for if you have clarifying questions. So if there's something that in what Tony or Jennifer shared that you have some clarifying questions, both stakeholders on the line and then also panelists, if you have questions as well, this is a chance opportunity for clarifying questions.
So as we move to take questions, please press #2 on your telephone keypad to enter the question queue. That's #2. Then please state your name, your position, and your question. We do have several questions already. So first caller, your line is now unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hey, this is Michelle Keto calling from the CPUC. I have a clarifying question for Tony Braun. He had indicated that you guys had discussed some of the more controversial provisions. And so I would just note that, as I look through the table of contents, Section 34 deals with the real-time market, and Section 34.12 deals with the issues that are currently before FERC. And I would note that it says joint authority on all of Section 34, but then in Tony Braun's discussion, he said it was their determination that they didn't think that the loads and wheel priorities would be joint authority. And so can you just clarify how somebody is supposed to read both the table of contents versus, if you go down deeper into the tariff provisions and come up with different, different assessments, like how will that be done and who will do it?
Yep. So there's going to be a process. We're going to propose a process that's similar to the process today to, I guess I should turn the video on, to assess a decisional classification. And we need to get into more detail, Michelle, on that. But I want to make sure we don't take anything that we said in the remarks on the slides as sort of conclusory. That is really reflective of some of just our internal thinking as we've tried to apply these things to how they might play out. There's other things that are nuanced like that, Michelle. We were bouncing ideas around the market power mitigation, and even in the context of the prior proposal, because it utilizes components of the LMP. Did that make it, even though it applied only to CAISO or to EIM entities, depending on the nature of the market power mitigation proposal, because it incorporated other provisions of the tariff, did that change the classification? So you have pointed out one of those really fine areas that we need to get into more explanation is as we work forward with the proposal, if we're going to move into it. And then as far as how that's going to be done on a case-by-case basis, we anticipate it's going to be done in a similar way to the way it's done today. and, that will be a sort of a living document, not some living process, not something the GRC is going to, obviously have a continuing role in doing.
But is your sense that one is going to know before going into this, or this is just a leap of faith that, eventually we'll work it out, what's under joint authority and what's not? So it's going to be unclear to everyone.
I think it's going to be done on an initiative by initiative basis.
Okay, so right. You won't know beforehand.
Correct. I don't think there's any way to have such a complicated and interrelated tariff parsed out with an absolutely immutable line.
Okay, and then my second question is with regard to this question of the outside counsel. So in general, I guess it's my understanding, and maybe you can correct me, somebody on the board could correct me on the GRC, that California pays 80% of the real-time market costs. So if you allocate it to real-time market, are you basically allocating, 80% of the outside counsel cost to California load? Is that your sense?
This is Jennifer, and others can certainly weigh in. Thanks for the question. What I was saying, Michelle, I think was simply that there are, I think, a number of ways that funding for outside counsel could be handled. And I was simply using the outside market expert for the governing body as an example of one way in which this funding could be provided. I am not 100% sure how that shakes out at the end of the day in terms of the percentages that you just provided. So I wouldn't want to say that that's how this would be funded, because this is simply one option for funding that outside counsel. I'm not sure if others have additional thoughts to add.
Okay, well, if no one has additional thoughts, I would just note that, it's really important to the extent that you're proposing outside counsel that one knows how it's funded, and, if it is 80% funded by California ratepayers, that would be, an issue, I think. And then with regard to the exigent circumstances and, this question of market manipulation, in general, CAISO hasn't found market manipulation. So can you, for example, the Order 831 initiative moved very quickly. I mean, do you believe that would, be exigent circumstances under which, we could make a filing at FERC even if the boards disagree? Just to give an example, that would be helpful.
Yeah, so thanks for that. And actually, Tony and I and some others who have been working on this had a conversation yesterday about this. I think, obviously, this would be a decision that would have to be made sort of at the time. However, to me, the most important factors here in determining exigent circumstances would be, is the change absolutely necessary to preserve reliability and to protect market integrity? And so on your question, I'm not sure if I can answer that now, but those are the two sort of criteria that would have to be met in order for it to qualify as exigent circumstances. Tony, I'm not sure if you have additional thoughts to add. I don't remember if we talked about the 831 issue during our small group discussion yesterday.
And just out of curiosity, what if the two boards disagreed about whether it's exigent?
So if
I can jump in,
Michelle. Go ahead,
Jennifer.
Oh, I was just going to say, in the way that I see this kind of playing out is typically before we even get to an exigent circumstance determination, we're in this phase of dispute resolution where we're in essentially a consultative process between both bodies and CAISO management. As a part of that consultative process, we are having discussions about next steps, whether this proposal is urgent or not, whether we need this measure approved to preserve reliability or not. Those kinds of conversations are taking place before we even get to this point. And so it is my impression that that determination regarding exigent circumstances would be made during those conversations. So that would be between both bodies and with CAISO management. And I appreciate your concern that we could be in a situation where maybe they're not in agreement about whether exigent circumstances exist, but I do find that highly unlikely to take place.
Well, let me give you Let me just give you an example. Let's say, there's something similar to what happened in 2000 and there's an energy crisis, and maybe internal load says, we really think we need a price cap. I could see, California, the CAISO, thinking, oh, we really need to go to FERC to get a price cap, and I could see the external entities saying, no, I really want scarcity pricing, and that's the way out of this. So I could see us disagreeing about exigent circumstances. So I just raised this issue as, just one possibility, and there are a host of others. So thanks for answering my questions. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, those are really great questions. And Therese, I'm not sure. It sounds like you had something you wanted to add.
Yeah, so I want to actually capture your questions, Michelle, first of all, and then also I want to ask Bert a follow-up question on something. So I think what I heard you say is, can you help us understand a little bit in the tariff matrix that's online, right, where it says joint authority over Section 34? How do we discern, right? Is it joint authority for all aspects of Section 34, or are there sub-elements that are not part of joint authority? I'm going to ask Bert to opine on that in a minute. I heard your question also about the funding for outside counsel and to consider that relative to the percentage of California in the market relative to the outside parties. And then exigent circumstances, who defines it? And maybe the question might be, because as it's written, it reads that the board gets to decide by unanimous vote if something's exigent. So I think it's a question of whether the definition of exigent is joint, or if it can be made by the board by unanimous vote. So did I get your questions right?
That's right. And maybe, Therese, you could clarify whether the exigent is determined by both boards jointly or by the CAISO board individually.
Right. I think, and I am gonna come back to Bert on this on the tariff piece, but I think that's a good question that I don't think actually have had before. And I think I appreciate what Jennifer's answer was, because I do think there would be conversation about it. I think you could also read it to say it's the board's determination about whether it's exigent in the way that it's written in the straw proposal. So it's a good conversation for the GRC to come back and have, because we haven't yet had that conversation.
Okay, thank you.
Bert, do you have thoughts about how folks should read the matrix, specifically where it talks about joint authority in the tariff matrix
Sure.
that we have online?
Yeah, yes, I do, and I feel like maybe there's to the extent some of this was language we worked on, or I worked on. Maybe it's causing some confusion, so maybe I should clarify. So for example, under Rule Section 34 in the table of contents, it says joint specifically where applicable to RTM EIM, and what that meant is you would go through the sections of all these subsections, and of course there's many subsections. And if you were revising a subsection that was going to actually apply to the EIM balancing authority areas, or EIM market participants within EIM balancing authority areas, then those would be the ones that are joint. I didn't mean to be suggesting with that language that every section subsection within Section 34 is necessarily joint. And to Tony's point, I think the way to think about it is there is a very fixed and definite rule, which is the rule that says that if the proposed change to the tariff would be to something that is applicable to EIM entities, EIM balancing authority areas, or market participants within an EIM balancing authority area in their context of EIM, then it's joint. Otherwise, it's not. So that would be the deciding way. That's the lodestar for deciding each of these issues. It just becomes very difficult because there are literally thousands of subsections of the tariff to go through and identify each one of them at that level. So that's the way we've been trying to approach it and sort of give some sense about how this would play out in the tariff without trying to ultimately answer.
And I guess I would say that if it's clear, then it seems like we should be able to answer the question with regard to ones before us, right? So then if you're saying Section 34.12 is not subject to joint authority, then, that clarifies it and makes it really helpful for parties to understand. So thank you for that.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. Operator, do we have other questions?
We do have another question in the queue, and I just want to remind people that if you have a question, to press #2 on your telephone keypad. Next caller, your line is now unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Elaine Ginocchio from the Western Interstate Energy Board. So I want to thank you for providing these examples that you did for the joint authority as you see it being applied. And again, I wouldn't hold you to what you said today as the absolute, this is how it will be decided, but it helped very much to understand with the examples. So I'm still going to talk about the export load and wheeling priorities because I feel like it's an example of, and if it's not, then an example of when you start an initiative out, you don't have it all assigned to sections of the tariff. That's the last step. And many of these initiatives they mix issues that probably will affect different parts of the tariff, and some might be board-only sections in that very specific chart, or some might be joint sections. So what happens when you get an issue like that? Hello?
Yeah, we hear you. And I was waiting for Tony. Thank you, Elaine.
Yeah,
we hear the question. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I don't know if that was for Jennifer, myself, or others. But let me take a crack at it nonetheless. It's a really good question. It's one we scratched our heads about. I would note that, I don't know, I certainly can't speak for everybody else, but if an initiative is calendared or identified in the roadmap and it affects the interests of folks that I represent, I generally don't look too much at at whom has the current parlance primary authority, right? It's important. It's going to affect the market. You're going to pay attention to it. I suspect we will run into those instances, Elaine, where where it ends up having broader implications than the immediate than the initial classification would suggest. But the classification doesn't affect how the stakeholder process is run. It affects how the ultimate decision is made, right? So I think we would have the opportunity to adjust as we learn during an initiative moving forward. So those are my initial thoughts on that, but anything that you could add and to help us think that through in the future would be.
Yeah, and let me just add let's say the issues are very intertwined and some affect board-only initiatives and some affect joint authority, rules. Would you err on the side of then this is a joint authority initiative, or how would you do that?
Can I step in for a minute here and venture a guess on this? I think this is a good question, Elaine, just as Tony mentioned, and our understanding is even at the very initial process of defining what they think the decisional classification should be, CAISO staff looks at the initiative, contemplates what portions of the tariff would potentially be impacted and how they might apply, and they'll put forward the proposed classification for stakeholder comment. So it's the practice that we do today, and so they'll go forward and we'll have stakeholders have the opportunity to comment on that classification. I feel like I recall, and maybe Bert, you can help me, that there have been initiatives in the past where the governing body actually has authority on one element of it, but not the entirety of the initiative, where you've kind of segmented out their authority based on different elements of the initiative, and that could be.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the way that, if you want me to speak to that just a little bit, under the current charter and the way the rules work, the first thing that's looked at in that situation is whether the different strands of the initiative that come out differently, are they one completely integrated package, so that such that we wouldn't even go forward and work with them except for as a package. That's one scenario. And then the other scenario is they're severable. And this language is actually in the current charter, so you can look to that if you want to see more. But And if they're severable, it becomes simpler in a way, because then what you do is the severable parts in current world would be primary for EIM or advisory, whatever the case may be, and you sever them and you use that approach. If in a joint authority world, I assume we would do the same thing. You would look to see, okay, the piece parts here, if they are not one package but a bunch of different things that happen to be in one initiative, then they're severable. And so the pieces that are joint authority would go through the joint authority process, and the pieces that are board only would go through the board only process. There is in the charter language about how to deal with hybrid initiatives like that are not severable, and I think we would need to further refine those rules a little bit. But come up with some way to deal with that process. I don't think the GRC has proposed anything yet on that.
So I'm going to ask your logic here, because this expert-led wheeling priorities under the current advisory authority of the governing body, they do have advisory authority over it. And when I read this initial definition of what joint authority is, the high-level definition you have in the early part of the section, to me it seemed to cover everything that's in primary and advisory. But here we have an initiative that export-load wheeling priorities does currently have advisory authority by the governing body, yet under your interpretation of joint authority, it would not fall under joint authority. So I'm just trying to understand, how did you logic that through? I don't understand how that sort of happened, and it's something in the way you're seeing this that I'm not seeing it the same way. So I want to see it the way you're seeing it. I'm asking.
So Elaine, we haven't really dwelt on the role of advisory authority too deeply in this proposal, but we would anticipate it would continue, right? So there isn't an utter divestiture of the role of the governing body in that instance. It's just that on areas where there is within the scope of joint authority, they actually have decisional authority. And so that's how I would distinguish it. So I think that it would likely come out the same way as it came out in the initiative that we just undertook.
Okay, thanks. And then one final question. In your standard for joint authority, you have this phrase at the end, in their capacity as participants in the EIM. That's the first time I've seen that phrase, and you used it quite a bit. And I'm trying to, if you could explain when you add that on how that changes it, or give some examples of rules that are applicable to an EIM entity or a balancing authority, but it's not in their capacity as a participant in the EIM.
Yes, we absolutely anticipate that is something we've got to flesh out in our next more detailed proposal.
And can I venture a response here at some risk, and others can step in the way? An EIM entity might be involved in the day-ahead market, right? They are an EIM entity, but they're involved in the day-ahead market. Anything that's related to the day-ahead market wouldn't be subject to these rules. So it is in their capacity as a participant in the EIM relative to their bidding and all of that in the EIM market.
You mean relative to their bidding in the day-ahead market? So.
Oh, sorry. Okay. So I think applicable to, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, I'm done. Thank you so much for your time.
Sure. Thanks, Elaine. So those are good questions, and have captured those as well. Operator, are there other questions?
We don't currently have any other questions in the queue. Just a reminder that if you want to ask a question, please press #2 on your telephone keypad. All right, there's no further questions at this time.
Okay, great. Okay, we can go to slide 10. These are the questions that we put forward to our panel, and if all of our panelists can turn their cameras on, and I'll do a quick rundown of who we have on our panel, and thank you so much to them for agreeing to be a part of this. So here's who you see. You should see Jeff Nelson from Southern California Edison, Commissioner Lisa Tawney with the Oregon Commission and also chair of the body of state regulators, David Rubin from NV Energy, Meg McNall from 6 Cities, and Josh Walter with Seattle City Light. Again, thanks to all of them. I told them I'm going to randomly ask them the first question and then the second question, and we'll get their perspectives. I do encourage, just a reminder to the GRC, if you have kind of follow-up questions, we'll have an opportunity for follow-up questions to the panelists, because again, the goal is to really get some good input for us in consideration of this proposal. So I'm going to start with David Rubin, and David, if you can answer the question, just the first question about how these proposals meet your interests related to the delegation of authority for EIM.
Sure. First and foremost, thank you for the opportunity to be here today and for the tremendous work that the GRC has put forward on this important initiative. It's been a lot of time, and we really appreciate all the efforts that the committee has made. As the EIM entities have not had a chance to coordinate comments on the proposal, I'll caveat that these are NV Energy's preliminary thoughts. And NV Energy's comments sort of throughout this process have focused on maximizing the independent oversight of the CAISO markets. In comparison to the July 2020 straw proposal, in which the governing body would have had joint authority over any and all proposed changes to the real-time market, we've moved further away from that independent oversight. Now, the joint authority would only apply to tariff rules applicable to the EIM entities and their customers in their capacity as participants in the EIM. But importantly, however, the proposal is clearly an advancement of the status quo, and to that extent, NV Energy is supportive. With the EIM covering more than 80% of the Western interconnection and producing over $1.3 billion in benefits to customers, I think we feel the proposal represents a necessary and incremental improvement. We think it's unfortunate that we could not do more and address the governance of a potential EDAM at this time, but it's very important that we don't do any less, and to that extent, NV Energy would urge the GRC to move forward with the Phase 2 proposal expeditiously.
Thank you, David. Meg McNall. We'll go ahead and ask you next.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
All right. Well, good afternoon. On behalf of the 6 Cities, thanks for having me today, and I'll echo David's thanks for all of the hard work that the committee's put in getting us to this point. So in terms of that first question one of the key areas for the 6 cities throughout this initiative has been about trying to strike the right balance between a desire by some of the EIM participants outside of the CAISO for more independence, as we just heard David articulate, and balancing that consideration and that desire for increased independence with the fact that for many of us inside the CAISO, EIM participation is not voluntary, and that's a difficult balance to strike. I certainly understand the perspective that the EIM entities have expressed as far as some of the benefits of increased independence, increased independent oversight of the EIM markets. But at the same time, it has been very important for load-serving entities inside the CAISO, including the clients that I represent, that we balance that with a consideration for the fact that entities in the ISO really aren't able to mitigate the risk of their participation in EIM and don't have choices to go elsewhere for participation in an energy market and transmission access. So that's really the lens through which we have been doing these proposals. Obviously, we recognize that EIM is expanding, has been expanding to include additional participants. That's a good thing. And again, recognizing that the EIM entities have a strong interest and desire for some independence in shaping those rules. So I guess that having been said, the 6 cities support the concept of joint authority and have supported it throughout this initiative. We think that the joint authority approach will provide opportunities for increased collaboration between the CAISO Board of Governors and the EIM governing body. And we also think that that sense of collaboration at the government level is extremely important in setting the tone for stakeholder discussions sort of on down through the process. So despite some of the benefits that we see to the joint authority model, there are areas where we think each EIM participant, including the CAISO, does need to preserve its primary authority. So the framework for joint authority that is in the straw proposal, to us, strikes a reasonable balance between areas where collaboration is appropriate and areas where independence needs to be retained. And I would, again, these are very broad brush classifications, but for example, I think that it is important that CAISO retain its primary authority over rules that are applicable to CAISO load-serving entities in the areas of resource adequacy, for example, or rates, terms, and conditions of access to and service over the CAISO transmission system, again, within the CAISO governing Board of Governors sole authority. So as the committee has defined the rule, we like it is framed in terms of applicability to EIM participants in their capacity as EIM participants. That's an important distinction. And we would like to see that element of the rule, that articulation of applicability, stay in the way that the scope is defined. We also think it's appropriately tailored. So again, as I had interpreted this, if a rule applies to an entity that participates in the EIM, but it doesn't apply to that entity in its capacity as an EIM participant, then the rule should be excluded from joint authority. That's appropriate. And then touching on some of the discussion a little bit earlier, I think that it is important that stakeholders continue to have the ability to weigh in on how initiatives are classified during the stakeholder process. As a feature that, as Tony pointed out, is something we have today. I think it should be retained. A lot of times it's something that as a stakeholder you look over and it looks okay. You don't it doesn't tend to get a lot of focus, but with some of the more challenging initiatives, such as the one upcoming on wheeling, I think that categorization is going to become more important. I'm happy to say more if there are any questions. And I look forward to hearing the perspectives from the rest of the panel.
Great. Thanks, Meg. Commissioner Tani.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to the conversation and for the continued hard work to move this issue forward. Really appreciate it. And I apologize if you can hear the kids in the background, but that's life these days. So like NV Energy, I'll just give a caveat that the Boxer has not sat down and made consensus comments on this, so I'll present my perspective based on, informed by the discussions that we have had. I think this is a really interesting move forward. It is, I think, simpler and clearer and more fulsome than what we have today, recognizing that we ran into a roadblock with the proposal from February. I think this is a positive continuation of the conversation. I think joint authority broadly is more reflective of a truly regional market, where on an intra-hour basis, resources that serve 80% of the load of the WEC are economically dispatched. And California is the largest load in that footprint, but it's no longer the majority load in that footprint. And this reflects how deeply tied the West is to the real-time CAISO construct. And I think that's appropriate. In some ways, this really puts forward a paradigm that's closer to regional decision-making. I really like, and to echo Ms. McNall's comments, the envisioning more joint meetings between the boards and exposing both boards to more stakeholders and perspectives. And I think that's really healthy. I almost think this is a move away from independence, in the sense that having two boards that make one set of decisions for EIM entities and another set of decisions for the CAISO VA, as we do today with primary authority, creates this opportunity for misunderstanding and bifurcation that as a really regional market isn't necessarily healthy. And bringing the conversation together presents the opportunity for the CAISO board to help bring the economic benefits of the seamless dispatch to California customers, but also vice versa for the governing body members to ensure they're helping the market function and grow in a way that works for the California entities. I say all that because it's, I think, important to understand what it means to sort of step back from primary authority, right? This isn't, moving to joint authority is on one level sort of giving up a piece for the rest of the entities in the West and inviting the CAISO board in to decision-making in a way that they had agreed to step back from when we set out the original governing model or governing model we're working under today. And I think that's healthy. I think that's a good thing as we try to move towards a more integrated regional market. I recognize the complexity of, as Tony put it, the it depends. And I think it's really interesting how it would unfold, because there are myriad ways you could design a solution to any particular problem. And understanding as the design comes forward what the governance will be is an important adaptability feature. And I think we will never be done if we try to do sort of checkboxes of how each individual potential permutation could land, and we rely on applying the rule as designs unfold. I personally am comfortable with that. Overall, I think the joint meetings, the idea of more functionally joint decision-making, recognizing each board would take its own votes, really enables the California parties to bring their case more broadly to the West and expose the region in a fuller way to their challenges. But it also enables parties outside California to bring their value to the table in a way that the California board can hear. We both gain an enormous amount from this partnership, and I think it's critical that the governance reflects that. The dispute resolution hasn't gotten as much conversation so far. I think realistically, within the legal framework that we're operating within, this is probably best case, and I appreciate all of the incentive and effort to arrive at solutions rather than send disputes to FERC to be adjudicated. I think that's healthier for the region overall. So I'll leave it at that, and really look forward to dialogue with counterparts on the call.
Thank you. Jeff Nelson, would you kind of share with us how the proposals meet your interests?
Great. Thank you, and good afternoon, good evening, depending on your time zones. And thanks for the opportunity to be part of the panel today. And I'd also like to join those in thanking the GRC, and not just the GRC, but all the stakeholders who put a tremendous amount of time and thought and constructive ideas on the table. Thank you. Thank you for all the input. Also, I'm generally representing SCE, but some of these are going into areas that are deep and nuanced, that are more my opinion and haven't necessarily been fully endorsed. And at the same time, in our last set of comments, we had support for portions from the Cal Advocates, and I want to be clear that I'm not in any way representing the Cal Advocates position here today. It's really SCE, and even more than that, Jeff Nelson's position at this stage. Starting with the support and meeting our needs, taking a step back, we're very supportive of the EIM, and we want to see it continue to flourish and continue to provide benefits and grow. I think it's been a very, very good thing for all involved, and it's reached a real sweet spot of benefit with commensurate commitment. It's reached a real sweet spot. I think that's where our starting point going into this, and I think it's still we're not opposed to this, that the current structure has been working really well, and there's a question of whether we should tamper with success. But it seems like there is consensus we should tamper, and the joint authority is a way of moving forward, and we're not opposed to moving forward. But we do like to say it's been pretty successful, so we want to make sure that anything we do to move forward actually is moving forward and not backwards in the success that we're seeing. So on the real positive side, I get the sense, and maybe it's Gaussian, there's a lot of agreement, a lot. It just feels like there's a lot of agreement on what belongs where. And this proposal is starting to reflect that. And I think there's real agreement that there's a whole slew of issues that really are ISO-only issues, CalISO. I think Meg touched on that. And this proposal is really clear on that. And I'm glad that there's clarity there. I think that's great. It feels like we have a whole bunch of issues that we could say resolved, where those will sort of stay under the current ISO's board structure. And appreciate also the ISO providing the GRC providing additional clarity on how the ISO's tariff would likely be sliced and diced. And I agree there's more nuance here. We really tried to put something on the table to get people to really think about all the issues that are involved and how do they slice, how do they lie up. Ours was, not the end-all, be-all, but I thought hopefully others think it was helpful also to really start thinking that there are a lot of issues and where are the proper boxes we should be putting them in going forward. And I really appreciate the ISO putting this sort of tariff section by section with, a rough cut of where they think it'll fall. So we really appreciate that. Another thing that's been touched on is the dispute resolution progress that we've made there. And I think those were very helpful conversations. I'm glad, and I think it was Lisa was saying that there's sort of a legal tension here about how far can we really go. We really appreciate this new development on here, on sort of not going forward with the dual filings, but trying to get some sort of dispute resolution that works its way forward, but has a way out to make sure things get resolved. And at the same time, make sure everyone's represented and has a clear voice. No one's voice is being muffled in front of the commission. And I'll just say that on a larger standpoint, even to items that are going to be under sort of the jurisdiction of the ISO's board and maybe an advisory of the governing body, we fully expect full participation. It's not that since the ISO's board has the authority over it that the conversation is limited only to the ISO full members. I think the robust conversation benefits stakeholders, the engagement. I think this goes into as we start splitting jurisdiction or how we're going to adjudicate things going forward, a robust conversation to make sure people are comfortable on how they're being bucketed going forward. So there's a lot of positive. We appreciate that. I do think, though, and I can say this, I wasn't sure if we were supposed to hit both questions at once or just the first question now. There are areas that, while we're generally okay with the rule they're putting forward, that if it directly applies to the EIM entities and their participation rule as sort of the general rule on how we're going to split things, we do think there's some issues where there should be discussions to the exception of the rule. And I guess the exceptions can prove the rule if we want to go there. And some of those issues roll back to some of the things that people have touched on, that there are some issues still that are ultimately going to fall back on the ISO participants that the ISO really can't afford to get wrong. Just really quickly, some issues like revenue sufficiency and defaults. We think with the unique structure of the market, if push comes to shove, people can actually exit the market. And California stakeholders are probably going to be at the end of the line when a default type issue happens ultimately. And so that feels more appropriate to actually stay in the ISO. And revenue sufficiency, the ISO has to stay revenue neutral or it can't do business. So issues that might affect the ISO's revenue sufficiency sort of feel like an exception. I think Meg talked about RA, and I think generally that's going to fall nicely within these rules. But as we've seen, RA is complicated. There's a lot of tangential rules. So I think some additional discussion on how that's going to unfold would be helpful. And probably the same goes with GHG, CARB GHG. Generally, I think it's falling in the right place, but because it is hairy, I think at least a little more discussion to see if there needs to be exceptions to be warranted. And I think another area to have discussion on is, I'll call it market power mitigation and new product design. Again, these are core and they're integrated into the ISO, and there's something that could really be catastrophic if they're not done accurately and properly. So I think we'd be benefiting all of us to see if on those sort of key issues, if maybe some exceptions are warranted. So we look forward to that continuing dialogue on this. So with that, I'm going to stop and, again, thank people for the opportunity to comment and look forward to further discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate it. We'll go to Josh Walter. We are answering the first question. I think it's great, Jeff, that you started to line out some of the other things we need to talk about. But, Josh, if you can talk about how this meets your interest.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Reese. First, echo all of the other panelists in thanking the GRC for the thoughtful and thorough review of the governance structure. I think that this exercise has been incredibly beneficial for market participants, so thank you very much. The GRC, in our mind, has developed important improvements to the governance structure of the EIM. It's apparent that the intent of the GRC is for the proposed improvements to provide certainty and protection to market participants within the confines of California law. And so from an overall perspective, the GRC's joint authority proposal meets the interests of City Light and meets a level of compromise or balance that Meg kind of talked about earlier. I think that is really something that is clear through the iterations of the GRC's program or process. So I really appreciate that. I do believe that the proposal generally meets the needs and interests of Northwest Public Power, albeit maybe not perfectly. And I note David's earlier comments on the broader application of joint authority. I think that's something that clearly has been pointed out through various commenters in the Northwest that would be something that would be maybe more beneficial. But again, referencing the level of compromise, this is striking a good balance. What the proposal does for City Light, and hopefully once approved, what it'll do for market participants is show that there's a willingness to make incremental changes in governance and hopefully subsequent market rules that are not based on the statutory requirements of solely making decisions with the lens of what's best for California ratepayers. I'd say that more than anything, that incremental progress is the most beneficial item that we are achieving through this process today. What we've seen over the years is that the EIM has been and is beneficial to all market participants, both inside and outside the state of California, and that to the extent we can continue to derive benefits for our customers through EIM and improvements to EIM, we're all better for it. And I think this proposal, as mentioned, it helps achieve that progress in incremental improvements of EIM. I'm also pleased with the GRC's recommendation on dispute resolution, although I hope we're not presented with an issue that divides the two boards. The mechanism put forth by the GRC looks fair and reasonable. I think that it achieves, again, a level of compromise that will help move this forward. That being said, and this is maybe getting a bit academic for the dispute resolution, I'm wondering if there's maybe opportunities or augmentations that would allow FERC, and this is the academic part of the conversation, that gives some level of superiority decision-making in a disputed filing. Understand, again, this is getting into something that might look more like a just and reasonable plus standard. But if there's something that the GRC can do to potentially look into the idea behind, the alternative filings and ultimately the decision making that FERC would make in terms of just and reasonableness, that could go a long way in getting more comfortable with the idea behind an alternative opinion or filing from outside counsel and from either one of the EIM governing bodies. So, that's just one of the things I've been thinking about. But overall, I think that we are pleased with both the joint authority model as presented and the dispute resolution proposal.
Uh-oh, I was on mute, wasn't I? So I'm looking at the time, and I'm going to adjust my plan a little bit. And rather than take kind of clarifying questions now, I'm going to actually go to the next set of questions, or the next question. It's just one. And it's what other interests you want the GRC to consider related to delegation of authority for EIM. And Jeff, I'm going to start with you because you kind of started to line that out to say, and what I heard you say is that we might need to do a little bit more fine detail looking at the applicability of this rule, and there may be some things that need to carve off revenue sufficiency defaults and look into some of the complexities around RA, GHG, and market power mitigation. Are there other things, other interests you want us to consider as we kind of move forward on this?
Yeah, and I'd like to say I'd like to have a conversation on that. I'd like to explore that a little more. I'd like to hear opinions and really talk that through because there are some really core issues that the ISO it really can't get wrong, because if it gets wrong, it's not just a California issue. It may be an EIM issue. It may be an issue to all of us. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about those and to sort of decide what the best way to approach those sort of really critical type issues is within this framework. There's another issue, too, on dispute resolution. While I like the general framework, I am concerned a bit about urgency. Generally, I think it's a very good framework, and as I talked to some folks, sort of offline, I don't expect this to happen very often. I mean, if it's happening a lot, we have a much bigger problem than the dispute resolution mechanics, right? There's something that's just inharmonious at its core. So I don't expect this to happen very often, but it might need to happen with a lot of urgency. And I think back on sort of like the RUC issues that we saw in October. where the ISO just figured out that some changes they put in just weren't working right, and they had to take some really quick action. And by the time we got to September, those were resolved, and the market as a whole worked really better. Those didn't require tariff changes. They were able to sort of work within the framework. But had they become controversial, here's something where we need to get a change in within weeks from when it was discovered. It was a very, very potential reliability market threatening issue. So I am concerned that with our dispute resolution that we're comfortable that if we have to get something done within weeks, days may be a little too extreme, but very, very short term, that everyone can look at that process and say, yes, normally we've got a good way to go forward, but when every minute counts, do we have a process we're comfortable in that we can really get something, even if there's disagreement, but something needs to be done to the commission quickly for action. What else would I like us to consider? I think it's just kind of funny. People are already, Freudianly calling it two boards instead of a board and a governing body. And, sort of my vision now is that there's one big meeting with 10 members. It's going to look like one big giant board. I think that's healthy. I think that's good. I think having everyone hearing the same thing at all times is really good. I just am wondering if people had other different visions of that, because now it's kind of a separate process where the boards are kind of, the board body are not always in the same room at the same time. That's kind of my vision, and I'm just wondering if other people have different visions of how this would work in reality. One big table with 10 people at it, or if there still be two different tables. And, in the optimistic world that we're actually back at tables together in one big room someday. Just something to think about if people have different visions. So I've said enough. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. That's good information for us to take back and think about. Commissioner Taney, other interests you think we should kind of take into account?
Well, I think, the central piece I think that comes to mind is really ensuring that the process of stepping back from primary authority and trying to move to this collaborative decision-making doesn't sort of get nickeled and dimed down to something that is less than where we're at today, right? And I think it's interesting sort of, and I really appreciate Mr. Nelson sort of posing it as I want to explore more and have more conversation around these particular issues, because if they're not done properly, it could be catastrophic. I think if we sort of stop and unpack those, the governing body's charter requires them to, is not going to give them space to take decisions that are damaging to the market in a fundamental way. I think their interests, the EIM entity's interests, in terms of those fundamental issues, are deeply aligned. Even to the degree we are not in a full RTO with California, if something catastrophic happens with the California market, we in the Northwest know we will feel the pain, full stop, period. I don't think anyone wants to see decisions that are damaging. So I think if we frame that discussion in how the two bodies' charters are written and their sort of fiduciary duty to the markets and the market function, I think we'll find a fair amount of comfort with joint authority. I think there is a lot of aligned interest around a well-functioning, stable market that delivers reliable power broadly. I really appreciate how clearly the GRC scoped out EDAM, and I think it's easy for folks to assume this is sort of an opening bid for how EDAM would unfold, but as a regulator, I see the EDAM governance conversation as quite separate and this isn't an opening bid for that. So just to be clear, for me as a regulator, I think this meets that need well, and to the degree that people feel like it doesn't address EDAM, that's a good thing. That's a healthy thing. And I just say, I think it does meet the need for urgency, but I'm going to take the opportunity on the platform to say I've met with the BOSSer this afternoon around the nominating committee process, and the urgency to illustrate that there is a willingness and partnership in California to continue this engagement is just really critical. The sense that we have all benefited from regionalization is well understood, and to Josh's point, the sense that there needs to be a continued willingness to move forward on that regionalization path, a really clear signal in the coming weeks is important, because there is really there's a lot of oxygen to other conversations, and there's a really strong sense the CAISO's proven there's enormous benefit to having dispatch across the full footprint. And I think there's a real hunger to maximize that, a real hunger. And so just carrying the message forward from my constituency that urgency is very real. And I really appreciate how much the GRC has taken that on.
Thank you. Meg, why don't you share with us other interests you want us to consider?
Yeah, so I don't know that I have other interests per se. What I do have are some thoughts about other elements of the proposal, namely dispute resolution, where I think the STAR proposal could be enhanced. What we like about the STAR proposal on dispute resolution is its emphasis on collaboration. I think, as Jeff mentioned, it's hopefully not going to be a frequent occurrence where there's a lack of agreement between the governing body and the Board of Governors on a particular topic. And so the focus on collaboration, even in dispute resolution, is important and I think beneficial. We think, however, that there are some areas for clarification there, and we've touched on one of them already. As I was reading the portion of the proposal related to exigent circumstances, it kind of sounded to me like, so I looked up the definition of exigent, and one definition is requiring immediate action, and the other is requiring or calling for much. And so that second definition kind of resonated with me, like more like something that was important but not urgent. So I think in thinking about this kind of need situation, I think it's better to kind of think through what that process is going to look like before we're actually faced with it. But I think it could be useful to distinguish between what I think is laid out in the proposal, which is the need for a filing that is exigent because it's important. It relates to reliability, or I forget the exact wording, to protect market integrity, and a filing that's exigent because it's urgent and we need to do it like tomorrow or next week. So I think thinking about that would allay some concerns about the dispute resolution process, which seems like its first step is to like re-stakeholder something, and that can be a long process, even in situations where the CAISO's staff is actively trying to expedite a stakeholder process. So that's one area where I think further work would be really beneficial. The other area that I think in dispute resolution where a little more work could be done is around this concept of the stakeholder remand and the governing body deciding to put a particular proposal on the governing body and the Board of Governors deciding to put a proposal in which they can't agree back to stakeholder. I think it might be helpful, and I don't know how workable this would be, but it might be helpful for there to be some articulation of the reasons or what it would be that the governing body and or the Board of Governors would expect to see in another proposal so that stakeholders and CAISO staff know what it is they're supposed to address in the second stakeholder process. And I'm analogizing that to what I see in Court of Appeals orders, where the court will usually explain when it's remanding an action back to an agency, it'll usually say why. So that might be obvious from the context of a governing body or a Board of Governors meeting, why something isn't being approved or why agreement is possible, but to the extent there's any guidance that could be provided, that might be constructive and make for a more collaborative second stakeholder process. So those are the two areas with respect to dispute resolution where I think the straw proposal could be further refined. And again, happy to answer any questions on those items.
Great. Thanks, Meg. I'm going to go to Josh Welker. Josh, you did include an interest, I think, in kind of your first one about related to kind of the FERC filing and some considerations about superiority finding. Are there other interests you want us to consider?
Yeah, sorry for jumping the gun on that one. But one other thing, and I can maybe touch it quickly because Tony alluded to it earlier. The one thing that it seems like has been absent from the conversation is the preservation or the ability of the governing body to have advisory authority on issues. I do think that is something that is important to continue to allow for the governing body to have a voice on issues that it may not ultimately have decisional authority on, but still may have some level of effect on EIM entities. I think the preservation of that is important. And then one other issue, and it's mainly just a reaction to Jeffrey's earlier comments that I'm not looking for clarification, but maybe just a caution that ultimately what market participants are looking for, what Seattle City Light is looking for, right, is a level of knowing what we're getting into, right? So, having making sure that we're not in a position where rules change midstream. And what I'm thinking about is it seems like there was a conversation about some level of a clawback authority that could declassify a joint authority to the Board of Governors, or joint authority to primary authority back to the Board of Governors. And I think that to me seems a bit problematic. That I just hope that we don't need to get to, largely because we're just having a level of understanding and security and operating within the rules is something that, again, market participants find critical in moving forward with continuing to be market participants. And that's really, that clawback issue is something that just came to mind from earlier comments. And then, and that's really all I've got.
Great. Thanks, Josh. David, we started with you. We'll end with you.
Sure. The good thing about going last on this round is I get to agree with a whole lot of stuff. First, I want to agree with Josh's point about the need to sort of clearly preserve the advisory authority. I do think that's important to do. Second, I want to agree with everything that Commissioner Tawney said. I just want to expand it to the Southwest as well as the Northwest for all of those points. On the dispute resolution, I agree with Jeffrey that it really should be a very rare circumstance, and with Meg that it's really important, and I think proposal does a good job of stressing the collaborative process that is going to resolve, I think, hopefully all of the disputes. But I do also want to pick up the point that Josh made about the FERC filing and maybe offer one additional step for the GRC's consideration. And this gets into, as you know, under FERC's burden of proof, the filing entity just has to show that its proposal is just and reasonable. It doesn't have to show that it's better than any alternative. Thus, the EIM governing body would have to demonstrate in those comments not only was this proposal better, but also that the Board of Governors' choice was unjust, unreasonable, or unduly discriminatory. And we think that it's better that FERC should be able to pick which alternative is better for the market, and that this could be accomplished simply by having the ISO, in making their filing, include a statement that if FERC found the alternative proposal to be superior, the ISO would adopt it on compliance. And that would give FERC the necessary latitude as part of the ISO's Section 205 submission to adopt the governing body's suggestion. And as this filing would only come up in exigent circumstances, there may not be time for a FERC rejection with the requirement to go back to the stakeholder process. And it also could be used in a situation where there's a FERC compliance filing due and you really can't have a deadlock between the boards. But anyway, that's just sort of a suggestion for the GRC's consideration. And then, thank you again for the opportunity to be here.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks to all of you. You're not quite done. So I'm going to open it up to the GRC. And are there any GRC members who have kind of follow-up questions, clarifying questions for maybe what you've heard from the panelists?
Therese, this is Jennifer, and I do have a question. It's following on that last comment that David just made that I believe was a follow-on to a comment that Josh made. If I might just have a minute to address that.
Yes.
Wonderful. So David and Josh, whoever wants to answer, but David was the last one to speak to it. What I was hearing from you was essentially sort of a roundabout way at revising our dispute resolution process regarding exigent circumstances to really make it look more like a dual filing in exigent circumstances. So in those very unusual situations where we have to move forward, we could, retain outside counsel, have them work with the governing body to prepare the statement, but that when going to FERC would essentially be given the ability to pick one of those positions over another. Is that what I heard from you? I just want to make sure I'm following your train of thought here.
I would definitely say yes, Jennifer. It's sort of a simplified version of it.
Okay.
It's sort of picking up on you don't want to have two formal filings prepared the way ISO New England does, so that you would just have the ISO make their filing. But obviously the concern here is, that burden of proof predates markets. It goes way, way back in time. And I think with that latitude on the filing entity, it really puts a difficult burden on the governing body, even if their proposal is what something an independent arbiter like FERC would find superior. And we really think that should be allowed to happen.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that, David.
Other GRC members with questions?
It's funny, I have a quick question for Jeffrey. Jeffrey, you've raised this category of issues that I'll call the failure is not an option category. Under this proposal, a tariff change does not move forward without the board's assent. So help me understand what additional protections might be above and beyond that, because it really does require moving forward, the board's approval to move forward.
Okay, So we've got, so in my framework, these issues would go just through the ISO's board, and it would have need the majority of the ISO's board to move forward. Under your framework, if there was disagreement, even if you had a majority of the ISO's board, but non-majority of the governing body, it goes into a dispute resolution process. And that causes a whole new cycle, and it comes back, and we don't know what happens. Maybe there's a middle ground. Maybe there's something better. Maybe there's something that can get enough votes to pass. It's just not clear that that's going to be, and then it may not get resolved, and then we're sort of back to the ISO. I take issue with the proposal of let's just keep dual filing by another name. But then we get another proposal that the ISO's board then ultimately decides on. Maybe we've gotten a little more process, but it just seems sort of the authority versus the accountability type of issue, that on issues that are these crucial, that the authority and the accountability need to be clearly lined up, and it's basically the ISO's neck on the line if things go wrong. So I guess it's more of a philosophy on governance structure in these situations. They may ultimately wind up in the same place, but with delay.
Thanks. This is helpful. This is good conversation. GRC, do you have other questions? Any GRC members have other questions? Okay, we're going to turn to the phone lines, and operator, if you can give instructions. If anybody has comments related to these questions, how does this proposal meet your interests? What other interests do you want us to consider, or any kind of comment on discussion? Now it's time, #2, I think, but I'm going to let the operator give that instruction.
Yes, #2 is correct. So if you have any questions to ask, please press #2 on your telephone keypad. Then please indicate your name and your organization, and then your question. Once again, that's #2 on your telephone keypad. We do have a few callers in the queue already, so first caller, your line is now unmuted. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon. This is Tanya Dorling with the Public Advocate's Office. I wanted to first say that I think there's been great progress in this proposal, and I agree with Josh Walter with Seattle Clean Light that you want to know what you're getting into, and this seems to be getting closer to being a more defined proposal. And we want to also echo the comments from 6 cities, Southern California Edison, and Energy Division, that there are still certain issues that concern California stakeholders in terms of maintaining the lights and maintaining energy in California, and those are resource adequacy and system market power. And we would appreciate a continued discussion on those items to better understand what are the EIM participants' desires and what elements of the tariff they are concerned with, and what elements of the tariff for flexible ramp product and system market power that could remain under types of control to maintain power in California. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for the comment. Appreciate it. Is there another commenter?
Yes. Next caller, your line is now unmuted. Please go ahead.
Oh, hi. This is Elaine Ginocchio again from the Western Interstate Energy Board. Hopefully these are 2 short questions or comments. So I got a little bit confused, and I just want to clarify something. Right now, rules that are generally applicable to the real-time market and by way of being generally applicable to the real-time market are applicable to EIM entities, are under advisory authority. Under joint authority, those rules go under joint authority. Am I correct in that?
To the extent that they apply to EIM entities or the balancing authority area or market participants within their balancing authority area.
Okay. So the fact that they apply to EIM entities plus the other participants in the real-time market doesn't change that. They still fall under joint authority.
I think that's right. I'm not 100% sure I understood the distinction in the question.
I'm just distinguishing between joint authority isn't limited to rules that only apply to EIM entities. It's rules. Okay, I got it. All right. So that does increase the rules. Thank you. The other one was under the dispute resolution process, there's this language in there that after the second round of the stakeholder process, they can decide to abandon it or move forward in some other way to resolve the matter. I guess I would just make a comment that this some other way have some parameters to it. For example, this other way should be open and transparent and possibly follow Kaiser's open meeting rules, but something along those lines.
Yes. Thanks. That's helpful. I think that is intended, but I think the concept there is that they kind of reimagine the issue and the solutions, but appreciate the thought about that being open and transparent.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you for this meeting. It was informative.
Thank you.
If there are any further questions or comments, please raise your hand by pressing #2 on the telephone keypad. That's #2 on your telephone keypad. I believe there's no more comments or questions in the queue.
Okay, let's go to slide 11. Slide 11 is next steps. Thank you to those of you that have stayed with us for the 2 hours. Here are the next steps. We're going to take...
Before we jump into that, could I throw in just sort of one more comment? I wanted to support something.
Yeah, go right ahead.
I fully support people wanting to have certainty of rules and how things are going to work and not have some sort of clawing back over time. So I just wanted to support those comments that we should sort of come up with how that's going to work. And again, I just like that dialogue on these other issues to see if there should be some exceptions. And we'd have to sort of figure out those exceptions and have people understand what they were. Something else that hasn't come up in this process were some of the sort of the attrition rules on what happens if so many people leave from the organization over time, or just what happens. I think some of those would still have to be weaved into this, but I really want to support those. That it should be clear, everyone should know what they're getting into, and it shouldn't rust or decay over time because the understanding wasn't clear at this stage.
Thanks, Jeff. That's really helpful. And do understand the attrition rules are kind of in the durability. One of the categories that is not in our conversation today, but I know that's important. We did receive a lot of comment on that. I want to actually, because Jeff stepped in, is there anybody else on the panel that wants to kind of make a final comment, something you haven't said and related to the conversation? Okay, just want to give you that opportunity if there was something there. Okay, so the next steps, written comments on the straw proposal and this discussion, because this is a really good, robust discussion, a lot of different topics talked about, by Friday, June 4th. And so we're asking for written comments, and then just depending on the nature and breadth of the comments received, we'll determine the next steps and what we're going to do relative to Part 2 draft final proposal. And we'll let folks know, consistent with what we've done in the past, we'll let you know what our plan is, but really appreciate your participation today and appreciate any written comments you might want to provide by June 4th. With that, I think we are concluded for today. Thank you so much.